Today we're going to talk about the problem that replicas pose for theories of personal identity. The problem comes, and hopefully we've talked about this in class, from the problem of transitivity. Transitivity is this mathematical property that you've learned from algebra, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A also equals C. But it's also the case that B does not equal C, and A is equal to B, then A can't equal C either. This is just the truth about identity in all domains. And so in the prestige, imagine we have Angier's stream of consciousness. Without anything weird going on, his stream of consciousness will look just like the rest of us, having experience at different moments in time connected by memory, connected by causation, connected by psychological continuity. Then at a certain moment in that stream of consciousness, Angier steps into Tesla's machine. After that moment happens, he continues to have a stream of consciousness, turning around, looking forward. After he's stepped through Tesla's machine, you have two different points in Angier's stream of consciousness. Point A, let's say, we choose arbitrarily before he steps into the machine, and point B, we choose arbitrarily a point after he gets out of the machine. Because point B is connected to point A by psychological continuity, by causation, by memory, the psychological continuity view will say that A and B are part of the same person. So if the person at point A is Angier, the person at point B is Angier as well. The problem is that Tesla's machine is a duplicating machine, a cloning machine. It clones in individuals with all of their psychological continuity intact. And so what actually happens is that at the moment Angier steps into Tesla's machine, a separate body is created with psychological continuity stemming from the moment that Angier stepped in. That is, from the perspective of the clone, a second ago he stepped into Tesla's machine. And a second later, he's looking at himself in the machine from a different position. That's what's represented in this slide. I think we can all imagine what it's like to step into a machine and then a second later, seeing yourself in the machine and you being on the outside. That's what the clone is remembering. But right after that exact moment, there are two different streams of consciousness. Angier, who's in the machine, is looking at very different things than Angier outside of the machine. So we have two separate streams of consciousness after the machine branching off. The clone body stream of consciousness and the original Angier's. We'll call that fission. So the problem of transitivity is this. We've already established that point B and point A are part of the same person. A equals B. But it's really clear that C does not equal B. There are two different streams of consciousness being conscious of different things. So B does not equal C. But C is connected to point A in the same way that B is connected to point A. C remembers A. C's memories are caused by A. C is as psychologically continuous with A as B is. So it follows from that that A and C are the same person, Angier. So by transitivity, B should be equal to C, also Angier's. But we've already established that B is not C. So we have a contradiction. C both is Angier and is not Angier according to our theory of personal identity as psychological continuity. So how do we address this contradiction? It seems that the only way to do it is to say that only one of B or C is A. There's only one Angier after he steps into the machine. Either it's going to be B or it's going to be C. How are you going to choose? Gretchen Weirob in John Perry's dialogue thinks that the choice is easy. Clearly, when there's no fission, B is equal to A because of bodily continuity. So, just because there's an event of fission and there is another stream of consciousness that's connected to A, doesn't change the fact that B is still A. We just have a new person, a new physical organism that is psychologically connected to A, but that doesn't make C equal to A. So the answer is B. Gretchen Weirob says we need to distinguish between the notion of actually remembering and seeming to remember. We need this distinction generally. There's a notion of false memories. People who experience false memories experience them as though they are real. They can't tell the difference between a false memory and a true one from the inside. And Gretchen says that distinction can be made sense of by the bodily view. Someone has a true memory if the very body that they had was at the earlier point when the experience happened. B has a real memory of having been A because B's body was where A was. The clone only seems to remember A. That memory did not get to C in the right way being C's body experienced it. C's body didn't experience it. C's body was only created at a point later than A. The soul view can also make sense of the situation. They would probably say that B is A and C isn't. Because in ordinary life, they would probably say, our soul continues on with our body. And nothing about the machine indicates that it's detached the soul and deposited it at C rather than B. But it really depends on what your theory of the soul is. I don't know what that is. I don't have a theory of the soul and how it moves in Tesla's machine. Tesla's machine is doing something physical. Probably it doesn't affect the soul at all. Who knows? But there's one answer that we haven't considered, and it's a logical possibility here. And that's the view of Derek Parfit, whose arguments we're going to examine very closely in the second half of the lecture. Parfit thinks that we can't choose between B or C as to whether they're the real Angier. Both have an equal claim. B can say, I clearly remember stepping into the machine and then turning around and seeing my clone. But C can equally say, I clearly remember stepping into the machine and a split second later being outside of the machine, looking inside of the machine at my clone. Come to think of it, what if the machine is a transportation machine? It scans someone, sends them off into a different location, and puts the clone in the very same location as where the original person stood. As far as we can tell from the movie, we just have two duplicates after the machine. It could be one way or the other. Is there really a difference between one way or the other? Practically speaking, at the very end of it, there's two bodies with the same memories. Those bodies are duplicates. One's going to kill the other. Does it matter which one kills which one? And Parfit thinks we can't choose. They both have equal claims to being Angiers. And so one way of following the movie is that Angiers does survive, A clone of his does, but there's no real difference between a clone or him. How does that solve the problem? Well, for Parfit, the way it solves the problem is neither B nor C is A. So there's no problem of transitivity. A is not B, A is not C, B is not C. We're going to see how that works after we come back from the break. But for now, you have a writing assignment. Take 10 or 15 minutes to answer these two questions in your Google Doc. Is it really true that you feel it's impossible to choose which of B or C is the real Angiers after the split? Make the case to me that you can choose, or make the case to me that you can't choose. And secondly, what do you think, as in the movie, of who is Angier if there's no point B, but only C? That is, the person drowns and another person is recreated. Do you think at that point C is equal to A? Why or why not? Derek Parfit's argument begins with another science fiction example, something you're all familiar with if you've ever seen Star Trek or even heard of it, namely teletransportation. The way that the teletransporter works in Parfit's example is that it scans the molecular details of an individual and then recreates those molecular details at a different location from the atoms that are at that location, and then destroys all of the atoms at the original location. Because it's a scan that's absolutely perfect, all of the memories and all of the bodily appearances are identical in the sense of being exactly similar. So in the thought experiment, consider the case where the teletransporter doesn't send you anywhere. You don't reappear in a different location. It just scans and recreates a certain percentage of your existing body right there on the transporter pad. Same location. Parfit asks us to imagine, what if the teletransporter just scanned 1% of you, let's say your pinky finger, and then just replace that right away? So it teletransported your pinky back to itself. But what it did was scan all of the molecules and recreated those molecules from molecules nearby instantaneously. Now imagine that it did that with 100% of you. That is, it scanned all of you, destroyed all of the molecules, and then recreated all of the molecules from the surrounding molecules right there. Here's Parfit's argument. He thinks that our intuition in these cases is this, that if it's 1% of us, just the pinky, it's not a replica of us, it's us. We just had a pinky transplant that's exactly the same as our old pinky. I think that's what I would think too. Parfit's argument then says, look, if it's at 100%, your intuition is probably going to be that it's not you anymore. It's a replica. It's just like scanning a document, printing it out, and destroying the old one. It looks the same, it acts the same. Let's say it's a perfect replica. Still, the old one was the one that's you and the new one isn't. He thinks that's what our intuition would be. So, we are committed then, argues Parfit, that there's a percentage somewhere in the middle where it goes from being us to not us, just a replica of us. Maybe it's 52%. At 52, it's still us. But at 53, it's a replica. Parfit says we are committed to that. if we answer the first two questions in the way that he thinks we're going to answer. Parfit argues that that's absurd. There is no such number. There is just one long continuation of 1% to 100%. It's ridiculous to think that for any percentage, n% means that it's us and not a replica, but n plus 1% of us is a replica. There's no such thing. What does that mean? It means that either 1% already makes us replicas, or no percent makes us replicas. That is, we should answer the question the same way, whether it's 1% or 100%. Parfit thinks the way to solve this absurdity is to answer the question the same way, whether it's 1% or 100%. Either say that at 1%, it's already a replica, or say at 100%, it's not a replica, it's us all the way through. Let's go back to our original example. You have Angiers and you have the clone of Angiers, both being psychologically continuous. Here's the way I think Parfit would want to answer the question. It's clear that B is not C. There's two distinct moments of consciousness there that are not identical. Since B is not C, 100% definitely makes you a replica. But the step that Parfit differs from the other views is that he thinks that this means that C is not A, but neither is B. Why not say that they're both replicas of A? They're replicas of each other, and they're replicas of A. Why would he say that? Well, real life is just like being in a transporter. Our cells are being replaced at a much slower rate than a teletransporter, but are being replaced all the time. And we don't think that we're walking replicas. But that's the way reality actually is. Eventually, you are 100% replaced. I think it's 7 years, right? Everyday life is like having a replica replace a previous version of yourself, just on a slower and smaller scale. And so what does he think is the upshot? He thinks that everyday survival is just like being in a teletransporter. There's a distinction between ego theories and bundle theories that he articulates in the paper. Parfit thinks the lesson of this teletransportation thought experiment is that we shouldn't be asking questions about who is really Angiers at point B or point C. We can't say that B is really Angiers or C is really Angiers, because to say so assumes that there's such a thing over and above the experiences themselves that follows the experiences. Bodies, souls, a subject of the experience. If you thought that, then you're going to need to answer the question, where does the ego go? Along path B or along path C? But Parfit thinks there's no need to answer that question. Why not just say there's a bundle that goes to B and a bundle that goes to C, and that's all the facts there are. There are no other facts about which of B or C is really Angiers. Parfit thinks that this view makes sense of split brain cases, which you read about in the paper and are fascinating. I'm not going to go into the details here. I'm going to assume you understand how split brains work. But what split brain cases show is that there are already people walking around in ordinary bodies, but for the fact that their brains are split along the corpus callosum. And that means that these people have two separate streams of consciousness going on simultaneously in one body. They really are just like Angiers, only it's not a point at which they step into a cloning machine, but a point at which their brain is split in two. And so each hemisphere is not communicating the experiences of the other. The lesson from split brains, according to Parfit, is that replicas and ordinary survivors are the same. No one has a claim to be the real you any more than the left brain has a claim to being the real you versus the right brain. And it's not right to say that the real you is both brains. The only thing to say is that there are two different streams of consciousness happening in that body. There are only facts about streams of consciousness, whether they split, whether they merge, how many they are, and how they're bound together. Parfit doesn't think there's any facts about the real person. The truth, the deep truth he thinks he's uncovered here, which follows Buddhist thinking, is that there are no selves, bodies or souls, no subject of experiences. There's only experiences that are bundled by causation, by memories, by psychological continuity. He makes an analogy. I don't know how helpful this analogy is for you, but it's something that I want to present just to see if it helps. Right? The analogy is with clubs or bands. I'm going to use bands as an example. It's an example that shows how you can agree to the underlying facts and also agree that there are no further facts. So for example, 4 people, A, B, C, and D, start a band. We'll call them Buns and Noses. A leaves the band, starts a new one with this other person, E. We'll call that band Imagine Wagons. And then B leaves Buns and Noses and joins Imagine Wagons. And then 2 other people, 1 and 2, join Buns and Noses. And finally, C leaves Buns and Noses and joins Imagine Wagons. And E leaves Imagine Wagons and joins Buns and Noses. Okay, those are the underlying facts. So at the end of the day, A, B, and C are in Imagine Wagons, and 1, 2, D, and E are in Buns and Noses. The facts we can all agree to. These 3 people are in a band, they call themselves this name. These 4 people are in a band that calls themselves that name. If this really happened, and by the way, this is a realistic example, millions of people on the internet are going to be arguing about who's really Buns and Noses. It's actually Imagine Wagons is Buns and Noses, because 3/4 of the original Buns and Noses are in Imagine Wagons. So they're the actual Buns and Noses. The people who call themselves Buns and Noses are posers. I can see how this internet argument can go. And it could go on and on and on and on. If you're Parfit, that's a waste of time. We've already agreed to the facts. A, B, and C are playing in a band together. 1, 2, D, and E are playing in a band together. There's no further fact about which one is really Buns and Noses. Similarly, when you have cases of fission, the facts are that there's a case of fission. 2 different individuals now have memories of the same thing. So what? There's no fact about which one is really the original. There's only facts about 2 individual consciousnesses connected to the same past. Let's leave this lecture with 2 more discussion questions that I want you to write about. As usual, you're going to come to class with all of these answers for discussion. How compelling do you find the view that everyday survival is equivalent to being annihilated and recreated new every second, every minute? Is it equivalent, or is there something very different? And secondly, a much more difficult question, are you convinced that if we cloned you with a modern day version of Tesla's machine right now, the new version of you has as much claim to your accomplishments, your stuff, your family, your romantic interests as you do? They deserve them as much as you deserve them. Think about it, write about it, and I'll see you in class.